The story of Concord is one of failure. Failure of marketing, failure of management, failure of creativity, and more. And that led to it being a critical failure, and more importantly, a financial failure. We've seen a lot of people saying it's the worst failure in gaming history, and that got us thinking, is it actually? There have been some massive blunders in the past, and in this video, we're going to take a look, do some neck math, and see who comes out on bottom. For the longest time, E.T. the extraterrestrial video game for the Atari 2600 has been considered the worst video game of all time, being so financially bad that it's often cited as one of the causes for the video game crash of 1983. Initially, it did well, selling over 2.6 million copies by the end of 1982, clearly documented as doing well in this Billboard Top 15 Games list. Although it did start strong, that would soon change. It's hard to find exact figures, but we have some sources that we think get us pretty close. Let's get into a breakdown of what it took to make the game, then sales, and subsequent failure. First, the licensing. In a New York Times article, Warner Communications paid about $21 million for the right to make a video game about E.T. So right off the bat, pretty good chunk of change. Next, in a Los Angeles Times article, Howard Warshaw, the developer, was paid $200,000 and an all-expenses paid trip to Hawaii. We're not going to try to calculate that trip, so we'll just take the $200K. Finally, in the book Master of the Game by Steve Ross, according to Ray Kassar, the CEO of Atari, 4 million units were produced. Now we reference the November 28, 1983 issue of InfoWorld. The cost to make a single cartridge for the 2600 was between $4.50 and $6. So we're getting between 18 and 24 million. As well, add another $1 to $2 for advertising, so another 4 to 8 billion. Adding all of that up, and we get a range of 43.2 to 53.2 million. But that's 1983 money. Let's run that through an inflation calculator, thanks Federal Reserve, and our modern day cost is between 136 and 168 million. We know that this number is not complete. There are other things to consider: shipping costs, cost to handle returns, and anything else we're not even thinking of. There's little chance that we can come up with a reliable number for these, so we're just going to have to leave those out. Now we need to find out how many games were actually sold and then returned. Going back to the book Master of the Game, Ray Kassar said that about 3.5 of the 4 million were returned. That's a lot, but it does mean that 500,000 units were actually counted as either sold or at least not returned back to Atari. Given the benefit of the doubt, we'll consider these as sold. And again, referencing the InfoWord article, with the average sale price of a 2600 game being $18.95, we get a sales figure of $9,475,000 in 1983. So call it $30 million today. We did find one old ad that had E.T. listed at $14.76, but another from Sears listed at $3.88, marked down from $34.99. We don't know what our 500,000 sold at, so we'll keep the original of $18.95. Unfortunately, on the high or low end, for E.T., we're at a loss. Taking our cost range from before and minusing the sales, we're looking at a loss of between 106 and 138 million. E.T. the game became so badly talked about that the urban legend that unsold millions of cartridges were secretly buried in a New Mexico landfill near an Atari warehouse became one of gaming's most well-known legends. In 2014, a documentary crew was able to uncover some copies. While they didn't exactly find millions of cartridges, it did prove that some of them were buried there to rot in their failure. We now have our first failure to put on the graph, keeping in mind that these are estimates, but we'll have the high and low end on there after being adjusted for inflation. That was a lot of math for E.T., and while we encourage you to do your own calculations, we're just going to post some final findings for a few other video game failures that are notable in scale. First is the Nokia N-Gage, a gaming handheld device that had a reported cost development of $100 million. And while eventually selling 1 million units according to Nokia, that was a third of what they had originally projected. We can't find really any numbers on manufacturing costs, and the N-Gage fluctuated in price, even dropping $100 in its first week. So while it makes the list, we don't have a really reliable number for it. APB All Points Bulletin cost originally $105 million to develop. Again, hard to track down sales numbers, especially after being bought out and sold twice, going free to play, and relaunching under a new name. But this slide from a 2012 GDC conference shows that sales were originally terrible for the first 50 days, and this other slide showing the downward revenue trend was only getting worse. Daikatana, John Romero's first game after leaving id, had a rumored development of 30 million. Another rumor saying that it shipped 40,000 domestically, so sales of 1.33 million. Even if we doubled that for the foreign market, so 2.66, that's still a loss of 27 million. In 2011, Shenmue's director said that development and marketing costs were around 47 million. However, there were some old rumors that the cost was around 70 million, and that covered Shenmue 1 and some of Shenmue's 2 budget. Shenmue 1 sold 1.2 million copies, Shenmue 2, a tenth of that, at around 100,000. Again, hard to calculate sales, but it was rumored at this time to be the most expensive game ever made, and it didn't come close to recouping its costs. Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League had a brutal development filled with delays and scrapped content, and some interesting co-developers. While we don't have all the figures for this one, we don't need them. In a report by Bloomberg, Warner Brothers took a $200 million loss on the game. We unfortunately don't have any number for Stadia, but we know it was years of development, they spent millions to acquire deals with games to port over to Stadia, and they ended up issuing refunds both for games and hardware. We gotta guess with all this added up that they spent hundreds of millions of dollars on it and did not make nearly that much back, hence why they shut it down. Not a direct one-to-one, but Google spent tons of money on other failed projects, like $895 million on Google Glass, and other failed products like Google+, Buzz, Offers, Wave, Lively, Null, and a ridiculous list more. What we're getting at is that Google has no problem spending buckets of cash on a potential game changer. Even worse, though, is when you work on a project and it never even gets released. The canceled Halo MMO, also called Titan Project, supposedly cost $90 million, or $127 million in today, and Fable Legends, the canceled co-op game, from an unnamed source, had burnt through its $75 million budget, or $99 million in today. Finally, we move on to movies. The recent Borderlands movie, with a budget of $150 million, has so far only made $31 million back worldwide. That's an $84 million loss. I originally wrote this bit a few weeks ago, so that number may have changed, but we don't expect by that much. The Far Cry movie, budgeted at $30 million, has made only $783,000 back, and Blood Rain, costing $25 million, made back only $3.6 million. There are plenty of other bad video game movies and plenty more that lost money, but nothing more substantial than Borderlands, so let's move on. For 8 years, Concord was in development. 8 years of payroll, 8 years of expense reports, 8 years of projected sales. This development time is key as it's the basis for the speculation on how much they lost. Like most of the other entries in this video, we don't have actual numbers, even though all over the internet are headlines and thumbnails of Concord losing $100, $200, even $400 million. We haven't seen any confirmed numbers from Sony or Firewalk. This excerpt from a Forbes article says it perfectly. The exact budget is unknown, estimates are around the $100 million mark, but there's no firm sourcing on that. So where does that estimate even come from? This Reddit post tries to give a decent answer, comparing it to known budgets of other games of a similar sized team, with salaries that are on average for the area, Bellevue, Washington, and over that 8-year development time. This is how you can get to the $100 million mark pretty easily. However, to get from $100 million to $400 million, that's a huge jump. So here's a few factors that may shed some light as to where that all comes from. Our first stop is probably Monsters, a video game incubation company founded by former Bungie CEO and president Harold Ryan. Basically, they have small teams of developers working on a game, and then when ready, they start looking for further funding and potential publishers. In 2020, they grew and started a third development team. Keep that in mind. Then in 2021, they announced a partnership between PlayStation and one of their teams, Firewalk, and began looking for investors. Later in 2022, they closed their Series A fundraising with $250 million, and as they claimed, the largest raised in video game history. In an article by VentureBeat that is linked on Probably Monsters' own website, so we think it's legitimate in what it says, quote, Probably Monsters plans to put the money towards its various development teams with the goal of building the whole company into a more stable home for developers. So, yes, there was $250 million raised by Probably Monsters, but that was not just for Concord, but the entire company, which again had by this time 3 separate development teams. Sure, Firewalk and Concord probably got the lion's share. They had been touting the game as AAA, and at that time was the only game even announced, but it still didn't get all of it. So at least at this time, it does easily cover that $100 million speculation for Concord, but getting to 200 or 400 million still seems like a little bit of a stretch. So let's move forward a bit. On April 20th, 2023, Sony acquires Firewalk from Probably Monsters. Unfortunately, the press release from Sony and all the news clippings we could find didn't give a price for the final acquisition. However, Sony puts in a paragraph about Probably Monsters stating that Probably Monsters has now over 450 employees between their 2 teams, more incubees, and whatever staff Probably Monsters have. This just again reinforces that the original $250 million was spread out throughout the entire company. This, though, leads us to the hardest point to measure: advertising. One of the main criticisms by certain gaming outlets was that Concord didn't advertise well, but we think we know where the budget went. On August 20th, Amazon announced a new animated series called Secret Level. Taking inspiration from a previous series, Love, Death, and Robots, each episode of Secret Level will focus on a different video game. Some are classics like Pac-Man and Mega Man, while some are modern games like Concord. As always, we tried researching what this might actually cost Sony, but without an actual answer from them, it's almost impossible to guess, especially if they're paying for extra to get Concord in there. Sony could have picked any number of their more well-known games. Crash, Spyro, come on, 12 minutes of just Helldivers explosions would have been a safer bet. And while yes, there is an episode of Just PlayStation for the 30th anniversary, for them to go all out for a new IP like Concord makes us think that perhaps maybe they did bet the farm and the whole company on it. One odd thing we discovered was that a lot of this speculation is based on that 8 years of development. This is repeated by tons of videos and headlines. Even some of the devs made this comment. However, Firewalk was only founded in 2018. Now, as we see before, I'm not best at math, but it's only 6 years ago. Are they claiming that Concord was in development for almost 2 years before the team was started? Who was working on it? How many people? How do we consider that those first 2 years are in any way similar to the budget of a final year just before crunch, just before the game comes out? It just doesn't add up to me. Now, when we first wrote this is where the thing ended. We were confident that $100 to $200 million seemed reasonable, but then, out of nowhere, we got some new news. Colin Moriarty, a journalist who's worked at IGN and Kind of Funny Games, now doing his kind of own thing, has said that he has spoken to someone who worked on Concord, vetted them, was very confident that what they were saying was the truth, and that person gave a lot of info. Most important to this video is that they claim that the game cost $400 million to make. Now, this is way above any previous guess, and the main justification for this amount is that the devs thought they had a Star Wars-like potential, meaning that it would permeate culture itself, going beyond just a game. The upcoming Secret Level would give them more provenance. They would be releasing standalone videos that would help deepen the lore, like that was a benefit to the game. That was a huge feature that they were pushing. And to reinforce this ideology, there was a culture of toxic positivity at Firewalk. You could not say a bad word about the game, the design, the gameplay, whatever. It was like if North Korea was a video game. So you've essentially got a bunch of yes men with their heads all the way up their own asses. No one's allowed to say it's a bad game. No one's reporting to their superiors that things might not be as good as they claim. And you've got Sony, who wants to get a big hit. They've got a former rival on their side with the ex-Bungie CEO, and they are chomping at the bit to put out a massive culture-permeating title that's going to put them firmly on top, kind of like what they had with Destiny. So them, after acquiring Firewalk, throwing tons more money at this, it doesn't sound like that a far-fetched of an idea. Now, Colin did not name this source, and we don't really expect him to. For that person to be public, they would get scrutinized by not only their coworkers, but perhaps get in trouble with their superiors, put their job at stake. So it's fine if we don't know them, but it does mean that we have to take that number with the biggest grain of salt. I don't think the source is lying, but without actual proof of the budget, it's hearsay at best. To help prove that budget, though, we could take a look at the sheer size of the development team. YouTube channel Gamers Prey posted the end credits for Concord, and it was over an hour long. Now, the text was a bit slow, but that's a lot of names. So we set it to double speed and got to counting. After just the first 21 minutes, we had over 600 names. Some of these could have been duplicates, and we did count out the special thanks section, or the babies that were born during development. Shout out to Rich McCain, trying to keep the birth rates up, my man. But these credits just keep going. We're looking at a minimum of over 1,000 people that worked at Concord. Not all of these were developers. There's advertising, legal, voice actors, musicians, other companies that were contracted, but the list still continues, and they all got to get paid. And Probably Monsters pride themselves on what they did pay. From their own website, creating extraordinary games fuels us, but we put equal focus on sustainable careers, comprehensive benefits, and cultivating teams based on shared values. You take a massive staff that are all being paid well. I'm sure our boy Rich from earlier got more than a few weeks of paid parental leave. Leadership and investors that have a ton of money and are wanting to spend it on a good game. Doubling down with sycophantic developers who refuse to accept criticism and tell those supervisors that everything's okay, and the publisher Sony, who believe it all enough to keep pumping that money in, it starts to spell disaster. Finally, we get to Concord's launch, the pitiful few weeks of play, and subsequent closure. Bottom line, Concord did not sell well. Rumors are that its sales were only $1 million. Confirmed player counts were abysmal on Steam, with speculation that PlayStation was just as bad, and with the closure, they gave up returns for anyone that wanted it. So we can't even factor a reasonable amount to take off of that development cost because we know there really wasn't any. So where does that leave us? Going back to the main question, is Concord the greatest video game failure of all time? Maybe? As far as an individual game goes, it's probably either number 1 or 2. Suicide Squad, because we know the confirmed $200 million loss, is our frontrunner. And depending on Concord's actual budget, it either tops that by a lot or comes in equal or just barely below, even when you factor in everyone else's inflation. For the entire industry, though, we still think Stadia might be larger. The cost of investing in hardware, the potentially larger advertising campaign, returns were for multiple games as well as hardware. That's a totally different beast and on a totally different scale. Concord was looking to make a good game that would spawn a brand new IP. Stadia, on the other hand, was going to try to shake up the entire gaming industry, going up against PCs and consoles alike. Concord was just going to be a symptom of the industry, whereas Stadia wanted to be the industry itself. After all this, we can ask, what did we learn? I think 2 important points can be made. First, money does not equal success. For as much as Concord and all the other games and products on this list that we looked at, they were all failures. For one reason or another, some more obvious than others, they lost money. And you can't blame the consumer or anyone else for that. Your monetary and time investments does not buy our attention or caring. We owe you nothing. And second, despite the massive failure for Sony, the industry goes on. We've come a long way since E.T. and the video game industry almost crashing because of that failure. And in an upcoming video, we're going to take a look at why this will never happen again. All to a decentralized industry. One company's failure isn't going to domino effect into everyone else's. If you liked what we did with this video, please do consider subscribing, leave a comment, let us know what your favorite video game failure was, and with that, have a good one.